The train did not slow gracefully into Cimarron. It lurched, braked hard, and exhaled a long breath of steam that swallowed the platform whole before drifting west across the grassland. Evangeline Voss waited until the steam cleared before she stood. She had learned over the past 4 days of travel not to move before she could see clearly where she was going. She stepped down onto the platform with a wooden box tucked under her left arm and a leather valise in her right hand. The box was roughly the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in brown canvas and tied with a single length of cord. She held it the way a person holds something they have carried so long that the weight has become part of them, not carefully exactly, but with a particular kind of attentiveness that suggested she would notice immediately if it were gone. The platform at Cimarron was unpainted wood gone gray from sun and weather. 3 men stood near the station house watching the train, and they watched her too, without any effort to pretend otherwise. She did not look away from them. She simply looked until they did. Cimarron in the autumn of 1884 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to become. The main street held a general store, a land office, a saloon with a new front that didn't quite match the older walls behind it, and a row of smaller establishments pressed close together, as though for warmth against the high desert cold. Beyond the buildings, the land opened without apology, grass gone yellow and red in the October air. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains holding the eastern sky, the whole enormous space of the territory, pressing in from every direction. Evangeline took it in. Then she looked at the road. She was 22 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches, with dark brown hair pinned at the back of her neck, and eyes of a color that changed with the light gray in shadow, something close to blue in direct sun. Her hands were not soft. The knuckles had a redness to them that came from years of needlework in poor light, and there were calluses at the tips of her index finger and thumb on the right hand, from a thimble worn so often it had left its mark permanently. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool that had been good quality once and was still presentable, though the hem carried 4 days of dust. She set the valise down and waited. The advertisement had said someone would meet her. Calhoun Red arrived 7 minutes late, which she would later understand was unusual for him. He came on horseback rather than by wagon, which she did not expect. He was taller than she had imagined from his letter, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that comes from years of outdoor work, and not from any particular vanity about it. His hair was dark, not quite black, and wanted cutting. There was a scar on his chin, small and old, where something sharp had caught him at some point in the past and left its record. He dismounted and looked at her. It lasted half a second longer than a stranger's look should last. Then he extended his hand and said his name. "Evangeline Voss," she said, and shook it. His grip was dry and firm, and released her hand exactly when it should. "You have baggage besides what you're holding." "That's all I brought." He looked at the wooden box and then at the valise and did not comment on either. "Horses here. It's 6 miles to the ranch." They rode out of Cimarron as the sun began its afternoon descent, and the light turned the grassland to something that looked almost like gold. She rode a steady gray mare he had brought for her, a good horse, well-mannered and easy on the bit, and he rode slightly ahead on a bay stallion that moved with a restless energy his rider seemed to contain by habit rather than effort. She studied what she could of the land without appearing to study it. She had been studying things without appearing to study them since she was 9 years old, and had learned that her father noticed when she paid too much attention to things he didn't want her to notice. It was a useful skill. She had kept it long after the reason for learning it was gone. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a main house of rough-cut timber. A barn in better repair than the house, a corral with 6 horses moving in the last of the afternoon light. And beyond it all, the land stretching away to the south and west until it met the sky. The fences were straight. The gate hung level. Someone cared about this place, or had cared about it long enough that the care was built into its bones. Calhoun Red dismounted at the barn and led the horses in. She followed. He introduced her to each animal without being asked. The bay's name was Conductor. The gray mare she'd ridden was called Patience, and she noticed the way he touched the horses as he spoke, a hand on a flank or a neck absent, and certain at once the gesture of a man who thought better in the company of animals than in the company of people. "You ride well," he said, which was not quite a compliment and not quite an observation. "My mother kept a horse when I was young," she said, "before Philadelphia." He did not ask about Philadelphia. She did not offer more. The kitchen was larger than she expected. There was a good iron stove, a long table of pine boards, smoothed by years of use, and 2 windows on the south wall that let in the late light. Someone had recently scrubbed the floor. She could see the wet marks still drying at the edges of the room. She understood then that this was not the kitchen of a man who lived comfortably in his own disorder. This was the kitchen of a man who had prepared for company. He made coffee without asking if she wanted it. She accepted the cup without thanking him excessively. They sat at opposite ends of the long table, which was longer than 2 people needed, and he explained the arrangement. He spoke plainly. The ranch ran 300 head of cattle and 12 horses. He employed 2 hands who slept in the bunkhouse. The house itself had 3 rooms, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a room that served as both parlor and office. If she was to take the bedroom, he would sleep in the parlor. The bedroom door had a bolt on the inside, and she was welcome to use it. "The legal arrangement," he said, "is straightforward. You become co-owner of the property by marriage. In 6 months, if either of us finds the situation unworkable, the marriage can be dissolved. You'd leave with $60 and your passage home paid." She looked at him across the long table. He was watching her with an expression that gave nothing away, which she recognized as the expression of someone who had practiced giving nothing away. $60 and passage home," she said. "And if I stay past 6 months, then we discuss what comes next." "What's the purpose of the co-ownership?" she said. "You could have hired a housekeeper for less trouble than a wife." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. Then he said, "Sheriff Aldous Boone has used a territorial provision to claim 3 ranches in this district over the past 2 years. The provision allows seizure of land with no legal heir or co-owner when the primary owner is absent during certain proceedings. I was away last spring for 6 weeks working a cattle drive north. When I came back, Boone had already begun filing paperwork. So you need a legal body standing on the property," she said. "I need a legal co-owner. There's a difference." She considered this. It had the quality of truth, the texture of something that had been turned over many times and still held its shape. But she had learned not to trust the texture of truth by itself. Things that were mostly true had the same texture as things that were entirely true. and the difference between them was not something you could feel with your hands. "What do you know about me?" she said. "What you put in your letter," he said. "Widow from Philadelphia, seamstress, 22 years old, no family." She nodded slowly, and that was enough. "The advertisement said I wanted someone practical," he said. "Your letter was practical." It was not a complete answer. She stored the incompleteness of it the way she stored other things quietly, where she could find it again later. She woke in the night to silence, which was itself unfamiliar. In Philadelphia, there had always been some sound carriages on cobblestones, voices from the floor above the building, settling in the cold. Here there was nothing except the wind moving across the grassland, and very far away a coyote calling once and then stopping as though it had thought better of announcing itself. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and looked at the ceiling. The wooden box sat on the chair beside the bed where she had put it. She had not unpacked it. She would not unpack it in any room where she was not certain of the door. Silas Voss had been dead for 14 months. She had said it that way in her mind for 14 months. Silas Voss had been dead. Rather than Silas had been dead, or my husband had been dead, because she had found that the full name kept a necessary distance. It was a trick she had taught herself during the first weeks when the grief, such as it was, had been replaced almost immediately by something colder and more difficult to name. Not anger exactly, closer to a debt that no one had volunteered to acknowledge. He had worked as a bookkeeper. He had been good with numbers and less good with people. And she had understood from the first year of their marriage that he carried things he would not share. She had accepted this because she was not without her own things she did not share. And she thought perhaps this was what marriage was. Two people keeping separate counsel under the same roof and calling that sufficiency. Then he died. And then the policeman came to the door and said it had been an accident in a mining operation. And she had looked at him and said, "What mining operation?" Because Silas was a bookkeeper and had no business near a mine. The policeman had a practiced sympathy in his face and gave her an address in the Kensington district, a company called Boone and Cimarron Land Company, and suggested she write to them for details. She wrote. They sent back a letter of condolence that said nothing she could use. She had gone to Silas's desk 2 days after the funeral and looked through every paper he had kept, because she needed to find the accounts he managed because there were debts, and because she was a practical woman, and practical women do not wait to understand what they owe. In the bottom of the locked drawer, she had found the key. Inside the lining of his second-best hat, she found a receipt. Received from Boone and Cimarron Land Company. The sum of $80 for services rendered in the matter of account verification. March 14th, 1883. Silas had died on March 17th, 1883. She had sat at his desk for a very long time looking at the receipt while the afternoon light moved across the floor. Then she had folded it precisely and placed it in the wooden box beneath the spools of thread and the paper patterns and the leather thimble case in the false bottom she had sewn herself from a double layer of canvas. It had taken her 9 months to find the name Calhoun read, not because it was hidden, but because she was not a detective and had no training in finding things that were meant to stay unfound. She had done it the way she did everything methodically, using what she had, which was needlework skills she could trade for access to offices and households, and a quality of attention that made people comfortable talking to her, because she listened without appearing to judge. A woman in a boarding house in Kensington, whose husband had worked the same mine, mentioned the name Cimarron. A clerk at the county recorder's office, for whom she mended 3 shirts, let her look at transfer documents that mentioned Boone and Cimarron Land Company's operations in New Mexico Territory. A retired postal worker for whom she made curtains happened to mention the name Red in connection with a property dispute he had read about in a Western newspaper kept for kindling. The name Calhoun Red appeared in a document that listed individuals with known disputes against Boone and Cimarron Land Company. He was one of 4 names. He was the only one still living on his land. She had read the mail-order bride advertisement 3 months later. When she saw that the ranch was in Cimarron, she had sat very still for a while. Then she had written the most practical letter she had ever written in her life. The morning after her arrival, she woke before the house. This was her habit. It was always easier to understand a place before the people in it were awake when a house was only itself, rather than a performance of itself. She dressed and went to the kitchen and found that someone, presumably Calhoun, had set wood beside the stove, but had not yet lit it. She lit it herself. While the coffee water heated, she went to the front door and opened it. The sky was the color of pewter at the horizon and deepening to blue above. The air was cold enough to see her breath. The grassland stretched away from the house in every direction, touched with frost. At the tips of the stalks, the whole landscape holding itself still. In the moment before the sun arrived, she stood on the step and breathed it in. Philadelphia smelled like coal smoke and river water, and the particular sharpness of too many people living in proximity. This smelled like cold rock and dry grass, and something she couldn't name that was probably just absence, the smell of a place where nothing was crowding anything else. She let herself have a few minutes of it. This was something she had learned to do, to identify the moments that were actually quiet and allow herself to exist in them fully, because they did not come often, and they did not last. In a month, in 6 months, she might look back at this particular morning and understand it as the last morning before things became complicated. It was worth paying attention to. Then, at the edge of where the east pasture met the tree line a quarter mile out, she saw a horse standing still. It was too dark to see the rider clearly. The figure was motionless. Not a horse grazing, not a horse waiting to be collected, but a horse and rider both absolutely still, turned toward the house. As she watched, the horse took 3 steps sideways into the shadow of the trees and was gone. She stood looking at the empty tree line for a moment. The cold pressed in around her. She went inside and finished making the coffee. She was not certain she had seen what she thought she had seen. She was not unaccustomed to her mind producing shapes from darkness that were not quite there, but she noted it in the part of herself that kept accounts. Calhoun came in from the barn at first light. He stopped when he saw the coffee already made and looked at her with an expression she could not yet read. "You're up early," he said. "I usually am," she said. He accepted the coffee and stood at the window looking out at the pasture while he drank it. She watched the way his eyes moved across the land, the way a person checks a ledger, systematically looking for anything out of place. Whatever he saw or didn't see, he said nothing about it. In the days that followed, she settled into the rhythms of the ranch, the way water finds the level of a new container without drama, without announcement. Simply by occupying the space available. She cooked. She sewed. She took orders from 3 women in town for alterations and mending, and Calhoun drove her in once a week to deliver finished work and collect new materials. On those drives, he talked about the land. Not in the way that some men talk about land as an asset, as a problem, as a thing to be managed, but with a kind of attention that suggested he thought about it even when he wasn't looking at it. He told her how the creek ran year-round because it was fed by snowmelt from the mountains rather than rainfall, which made it reliable in drought years. He told her the names of the ranches that bordered his to the north and west and east, and mentioned without elaborating that the one to the south had changed hands 18 months ago. She asked who had owned it before. He said a man named Grath. Then he changed the subject. She let him change it, but she added Grath to her accounts. On the 4th day, she went into his office while he was outside working and opened the center drawer of his desk. She did this not because she was careless about his privacy, but because she needed to understand what kind of man she was living with. And a desk told you things about a person that a week of meals and conversation might not. She had learned this from Silas, who had kept his desk so scrupulously blank that it had told her immediately something was hidden. Calhoun's desk was not blank. It was the desk of a man who did his own accounting and trusted his own records ledgers written in a clear, compressed hand. Receipts organized by date. A letter from an attorney in Santa Fe that she only glanced at long enough to register that it concerned a land boundary. There was a newspaper from Denver folded to a story about the railroad expansion into the territory. There was a small book of surveying mathematics with his name written inside the cover, in younger, less practiced handwriting, and under the book folded twice a mail-order bride advertisement. Her name was circled in blue pencil. Not just marked, circled the circle drawn with some pressure, as though someone had come back to it more than once. Beside the circle, nearly erased but still visible if you held the paper to the light, a small question mark. She stood at the desk for a moment, holding the advertisement, looking at her own name circled in someone else's pencil, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, and not anger, and not the cold satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed. Something more difficult than any of those. Something that required her to stand still for a moment before she trusted herself to fold the paper exactly as she had found it and place it back under the book. She went back to the kitchen. She began the bread for supper. When Calhoun came in that evening, she asked him with complete composure what he knew about the Boone family's operation before they came to New Mexico. He looked at her from across the kitchen. "Not much," he said. "Why?" "I'm trying to understand the landscape," she said. "The human landscape. It helps me to know who's been where." He accepted this. He did not believe it entirely. She could see that in the quality of the pause before he answered. But he accepted it. "Boone came from Kansas," he said. "Had a land operation there first. The stories from Kansas are not good stories. What happened to the people in the Kansas operation? Some left. Some stayed and lost everything to legal process." He was quiet for a moment. "2 died in work accidents." She said nothing. She turned back to the stove. "Evie," he said. It was the first time he had shortened her name. She turned. "Are you afraid of something?" he said. "Or are you looking for something?" She met his eyes. They were dark brown, very steady, the eyes of a man who had decided some time ago not to look away from things that were difficult. She understood that he was asking her a real question and expected, or at least hoped for, a real answer. "I'm looking for information," she said. "That's all. I was a bookkeeper's wife. I like to have the full account." He nodded slowly. He did not tell her she was lying. He also did not tell her she was right. He simply accepted the partial answer with the expression of a man who had learned that partial answers were sometimes all that was available and that pushing for more was not always the wise move. She turned back to the stove and he went to wash up, and neither of them said anything more about it. Nora Finch ran the only laundry in Cimarron, and she had run it alone for 3 years since her husband Dermot had died in what the official record described as a mining accident, and what she described, when she described it at all, as a morning that had not been predictable from the evening before it. She was 35, with hair that had been red, and was now red mixed with something silver at the temples, and eyes of an amber that turned almost gold when she was angry, which was frequently. She was not a warm woman in the way that women were expected to be warm. She did not offer tea automatically or ask about your family before she had asked about your business. But she was honest, and in Cimarron honest people knew each other by that quality the way miners know the sound of solid rock versus hollow. She met Evangeline Voss on the woman's second trip to town, when Evangeline came to pick up a dress that had been sent for pressing. Nora handed over the dress and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who did not pretend not to be assessing. "You're Red's wife," she said. "I am," Evangeline said. "New to the territory." "Yes." Nora looked at her for another moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for practical information rather than conversation, "There's a women's exchange at the church on Thursday afternoons. If you're selling needlework, that's where to start." "Thank you," Evangeline said. "I'll come." Nora wrapped the dress in brown paper without being asked. She did not make small talk. When Evangeline was at the door, Nora said, without looking up from the counter, "Be careful with Sheriff Boone. He's a very polite man." The way she said polite was the way a person says a word that means something different than what it means. Evangeline stood with her hand on the doorframe. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She walked back to the wagon where Calhoun was loading supplies from the general store and did not mention the exchange. But she thought about the way Nora Finch had said polite, and she added it to the account she was keeping, which was filling up faster than she had expected. The Thursday women's exchange at the church produced 4 orders for Evangeline, 2 alterations, a christening gown, and a commission for a full dress from the wife of the district's only surveyor, who had money and opinions about sleeves. She sat in the church hall for 2 hours, drank coffee that was too weak, and listened to women talk about the territory, the way people talk about a place they have decided to make their permanent home, which requires believing it is better than the alternatives, even when it is difficult. She heard the name Boone 3 times in 2 hours. Each time the conversation altered slightly, a particular quality of care that people apply to sentences when they know they might be repeated. She heard the name Grath once from an older woman with a garden that someone had admired. The older woman said, "When Grath left, he left in a hurry. Didn't take the garden tools." And then she stopped as though she had said more than she intended. On the way home, Calhoun drove, and she sat beside him in the wagon, with her orders folded in her lap. "What did Grath do before he left?" she said. Calhoun kept his eyes on the road. farmed, ran some cattle, same as everyone. Did he want to leave? A pause. The wagon rolled over a rough section of road and steadied again. No, he said. He didn't. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. But the way he held the reins had changed slightly. A small additional tension in the hands that she noticed. Because she noticed those things. She looked out at the grassland going amber in the late afternoon. Amos Marsh was waiting at the gate of the Red Ranch when they returned a man in his 60s, with a face like weathered saddle leather and hands that had done hard labor for 40 years and showed it. He was Calhoun's nearest neighbor to the north with a small operation of his own, and a habit of arriving without announcement that suggested he was either comfortable enough with Calhoun to dispense with formality or concerned enough about something to not waste time with it. He looked at Evangeline with a quick evaluating glance, and then looked at Calhoun. The boy from the land office came around, he said. Left a notice. Calhoun took the paper Marsh handed him and read it without expression. Evangeline watched his face. What does it say? She asked. He handed it to her. It was a standard territorial form, and it said that the co-ownership registration filed with the land office was under review pending verification of continuous residence by the co-owner, and that under Territorial Code Section 14. A co-owner who could not demonstrate continuous residence of no fewer than 90 days was not considered a valid co-owner for the purposes of property succession proceedings. She had been at the ranch for 11 days. She read the form twice, then she handed it back to Calhoun. He's starting the clock, she said. He's been watching the ranch, Calhoun said. He would have known the day you arrived. I expected the notice. I did not expect it this fast. Amos Marsh stood at the fence looking out at the pasture, giving them the space to talk that he had apparently decided they needed. He was a man who had learned the precise calibration of when to be present and when to be invisible, and she appreciated that quality, even as she filed him away as someone who already knew more of this story than she did. 79 days, she said. Until the 90-day mark, Calhoun said. Then we have 79 days to make sure everything is in order. She looked at the form again. What does he do when the 90 days are up and everything is in order? Calhoun said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, he finds something else. The way he said it told her that Boone finding something else was not a hypothetical. It was a pattern. And Calhoun had been watching it long enough to understand that legal protection was necessary, but not sufficient. She folded the form and held it against her hip and looked at the mountains in the east, which were turning purple in the fading light. This was the second time she had done a calculation she had not expected to be making when she arrived. The first was the morning she had found the circled advertisement on his desk, when she had stood very still and understood that whatever had brought both of them to this house was more complicated than either of their letters had suggested. The account, she thought, was getting very full, and in the false bottom of the wooden box on the chair beside her bed beneath the spools of thread and the leather thimble case and the paper patterns a receipt marked Boone and Cimarron. Land Company was waiting as it had been waiting for 14 months for someone to ask the right question in a room where it could be heard. She had not yet decided if Calhoun Red was that someone. She had 79 days to find out. 3 weeks passed the way the territory measured time, not by what happened, but by what didn't. No letter from Boone's office, no further notices. No riders at the tree line in the early morning, or none that she could confirm. She sewed, She cooked. She delivered finished work to town and collected new orders and listened. She was good at listening. People in Cimarron were not particularly guarded with a seamstress. The relationship had an intimacy to it. A woman standing close to you with pins in her mouth and her hands at your waist that made people talk more freely than they intended. She heard about the Grath Ranch purchased at a quarter of its value by a holding company in Santa Fe, whose registered agent shared a surname with Boone's deputy. She heard about a water rights dispute that had resolved itself just before the previous winter, in a way that no one entirely believed. She heard things without asking for them, and she stored them with the precision she had learned from years of keeping someone else's household accounts. She also watched Calhoun read, not with suspicion exactly, though suspicion was still present underneath everything, a groundwater that never quite dried up. She watched him the way she watched everything in a new place, to understand the pattern, to find where the pattern held and where it didn't. A man's pattern told you more than his words did. Words could be prepared. Pattern was something that built up over time without anyone arranging it. He woke before dawn every morning. He checked the cattle before breakfast, not because it was necessary every day, but because he was the kind of man who did not trust routine to substitute for attention. He kept the barn cleaner than most men kept their houses. He read in the evenings history, surveying occasionally a novel he never mentioned, which he kept turned face down when he set it aside. He paid Amos Marsh back for small favors within a day or two, never letting the balance tilt too far toward debt. She was gradually understanding, a man who found disorder in his obligations more troubling than disorder in his house. She found this information useful. She filed it away. What she did not file away, because she didn't know yet where to put it, was the quality of his silences. There were men whose silences were vacant, and men whose silences were occupied, and Calhoun's were decidedly the latter. When he sat at the table in the evenings with his book or his accounts, the quietness around him had a weight to it, a density, as though there were thoughts happening that required more space than the room provided. She had grown up around a man whose silences meant nothing was happening. She had been married to a man whose silences meant something was being hidden. She was not yet certain which kind Calhoun's were. Some evenings she sat across the table from him and sewed while he read, and they did not speak for an hour at a time. And it was, she acknowledged this to herself with some difficulty, the least uncomfortable silence she could remember being in. On a Tuesday morning in the third week, the autumn light arrived at a particular angle that turned the frost on the grass to something close to fire, and Calhoun's vest caught on a fence post and tore along the shoulder seam with a sound like a small argument concluding. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has just been reminded that the physical world does not care about his schedule. She was on the porch when it happened, collecting a finished dress for delivery. She saw the tear from 20 feet away. "Bring it here," she said. He looked uncertain for a moment, not embarrassed exactly, but with the particular hesitation of a man who is not accustomed to being helped. He brought the vest. She found needle and thread and sat on the porch step, and he sat beside her, not at a polite distance, but close enough that she could hold the fabric to proper tension. She threaded the needle without looking at it, a thing she had done so many times that her fingers knew the motion, without requiring instruction from her eyes. "Hold this edge," she said. He held it. His hands were much larger than the task required, and he managed the fabric with the careful inexactness of a person for whom this was simply not their usual work. Overcorrecting twice, then stopping when he understood she had noticed, then finding a steadiness that came from attention rather than experience. "My mother taught me to sew when I was 5, she said. She kept her eyes on the work. She said it was the most honest skill a woman could have. You could always see exactly what you'd done and whether it was good." What did she mean by honest? She considered this, that the work didn't lie. A seam held or it didn't. A hem was straight or it wasn't. You couldn't convince yourself it was better than it was. He was quiet for a moment. "My father said the same thing about fences." She glanced up. It was the first time he had mentioned his father without being asked. "Were you close?" she said. "He died when I was 14, so I had enough time to know him and not enough time to stop measuring myself against him." The honesty of this caught her off guard. She returned to the seam. "That's a particular kind of difficult," she said. "Yes," he said simply, not elaborating, not retreating from it, just acknowledging that it was true. They sat in the autumn light with the smell of frost burning off the grass, and she taught him a basic running stitch, guiding his index finger along the line of the seam so he understood the spacing. He was a poor student in the technical sense. His fingers were too accustomed to rope and reins to manage anything delicate without effort. But he was attentive, and he did not pretend to be better at it than he was, which she found she preferred. "You could learn it," she said, "if you needed to." "I could learn most things," he said, "if I needed to." She tied off the thread and broke it clean. She held the repaired vest to the light, inspecting the seam. It would hold. When she handed it back to him, their fingers met at the edge of the fabric for a moment that was 2 seconds long at most. She registered it, noted it in the part of herself that noted things, and then set it aside in the same motion. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open slightly unguarded, as though something had arrived in the moment that he had not arranged for. Then he said, "Thank you," and stood and put the vest on and went back to work. She remained on the porch step for a minute longer, her needle case in her hand, looking at the place where the frost had been before the sun took it. Through the south-facing window, she did not see Nora Finch standing at the corner of the fence with a wrapped package in her hands, looking at the porch step, and then turning to leave the package on the post and walking away without knocking. She found the package an hour later when she went to the gate. A length of new black thread, better quality than what she'd ordered. No note. Boone came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week, which was, she would later understand, a calculated choice. Calhoun had told her the week before that Wednesdays were when he met with Amos Marsh to review the boundary surveys they were preparing for the county. He would be gone from the ranch most of the afternoon. The sheriff arrived with a deputy she had not seen before, a young man with a carefully blank face and the posture of someone who had been told to stand straight and had confused that instruction with not moving. Boone himself rode a gray horse in excellent condition, wore clothes that were somewhat too fine for a working sheriff in a small territory town, and dismounted with the ease of a man who was very comfortable in his own authority. He was 60 or close to it. The mustache was white and precise. His eyes were pale, not blue, not gray, but the specific color of ice over very deep water, which gave nothing away about the depth underneath. "Mrs. Red," he said with a warmth that was so perfectly calibrated, she felt it as a kind of pressure. "I've been meaning to come by and welcome you to the district. We don't often get new arrivals who come to stay." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "I'm sorry my husband isn't here to—" "Oh, no matter," he said easily. "It's you I came to meet. A man's wife tells you more about a place than the man does. They always know how things actually work." She stepped back and led him into the kitchen, because there was no legitimate reason not to, and because showing reluctance would tell him things she was not ready to tell. She put the coffee on. He sat at the table with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been in the room before, which she noted. He talked about the territory. He talked about the difficulty of building something in a place that was still finding its own law. He talked about the importance of community and cooperation, and the particular loneliness of frontier life, all of it delivered in a voice that was pleasant and thoughtful, and entirely empty of the thing beneath it, which she could feel, but could not name precisely. It was like listening to someone read a letter while holding a different letter behind their back. The deputy stood near the door and looked at the floor. She poured coffee and sat across from Boone and answered his questions about Philadelphia and her work, and what she thought of New Mexico. And she did it with the same quality of attention she gave to everything complete on the surface, full of calculation underneath. Then the deputy said something about the horses and went outside, and they were alone. Boone turned his cup on the table. He looked at her without the warmth of before, not unfriendly, but direct in the manner of someone assessing rather than performing. "Mrs. Red," he said, "you're an intelligent woman. I can see that. I find I'm more comfortable speaking plainly with intelligent people." "I appreciate plain speaking," she said. "Good." He paused. "I know the name Silas Voss." She did not move. She kept her hands around the coffee cup and did not move, and kept her face in the arrangement she had set it in before he began talking, because any change in the arrangement now would be as good as a word spoken. "I know the name Silas Voss," he said again, as though the repetition were a courtesy, a second chance. "And I know why you're here. And I want you to understand that I think of myself as a reasonable man." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the deputy was making sounds near the horses. Manufactured sounds she understood to give Boone the room he wanted. Boone leaned slightly forward. He spoke in a register just above a murmur, which meant she had to be still and attentive to hear it, which meant that any response she made would be noted. "I know what you came looking for," he said. "And I know that you haven't found it yet, or we'd be having a different conversation. I'm offering you the version of this conversation that ends better for everyone. Take what Red is offering you, $60 passage home or whatever other arrangement suits you, and go back to Philadelphia. You can't win what you're playing for, Mrs. Red. You don't have the cards." He leaned back, picked up his coffee. The warmth returned to his face like a lamp being turned up. "New Mexico is a beautiful territory," he said, "but it's hard on people who don't understand it." He said it as a statement of geography. She understood it as something else entirely. She smiled at him. It was not a complicated smile. It was the particular smile that she had learned very young when her father was in one of his moods, and it was necessary to be pleasant without giving ground, which required keeping the smile separate from the eyes. "Thank you for the welcome, Sheriff," she said. "I'll tell my husband you came by." He stood, put on his hat, and said something gracious about the coffee. At the door, he paused and turned back with the expression of a man who has almost forgotten to mention something. 79 days was it when you arrived, he said. Remarkable that anyone keeps track. I keep track of everything, she said. He smiled at that genuinely for the first time. I thought you might, he said, and walked out. She stayed at the table until she heard the horses leave. Then she put her hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. Her fingers were pressing down hard enough that the tips had gone white. She released the pressure slowly. She turned her hands over and looked at her palms. She knew what he had told her. He had told her that he knew exactly who she was and why she had come. He had told her that she was exposed. He had also told her in the same breath that he had not yet moved against her, which meant either he was confident enough that she posed no threat to take his time, or he wanted her to leave on her own terms rather than to force the matter, because forcing it created records. He was not a man who moved without knowing exactly what he was moving toward. The riders at the fence line, if they came, would not be escalation. They would be information gathering. He was still learning what she had. That was why he had come today with words instead of paperwork. What he had not told her was whether he knew about Calhoun's knowledge of her, or whether the two of them were in his understanding two separate problems or one combined one. This was the most important thing she did not know. When Calhoun came home 2 hours later and found her at the table with an unfinished hem in her hands, and the afternoon light going long through the south windows, he stopped in the doorway. "Are you all right?" he said. "Boone came by," she said. The quality of his stillness changed. He came to the table and sat down not across from her, but at the corner closer than the arrangement of the space required. What did he say? She looked at him. He was watching her with those steady, dark eyes, and she thought about the question mark beside her circled name, and she thought about the quality of his silences, and she thought about the way he had said, "I wanted a co-owner," without finishing the sentence. And she made a decision. Not the whole truth. Not yet. But more than she had given him before. "He told me he knew I wasn't only here to be a rancher's wife," she said. "He didn't say what he thought I was looking for. He told me to leave." Calhoun was quiet for a long time. She watched his hands on the table, large and still, the hands of a man who was thinking something through rather than reacting to it. "Did he threaten you?" he said. "He was very polite," she said. Something in his jaw tightened. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but she was close enough to see it. "Are you gonna tell me," he said slowly, "what it is you're actually looking for?" She held his gaze. "Are you gonna tell me why you circled my name before I wrote to you?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Not tonight." "Then not tonight," she said. They stayed at the table a while longer, the unfinished hem in her hands, and the evening coming down outside, two people in the same room with the same unspoken knowledge arranged between them, like a piece of furniture they were both choosing to walk around. The letter from Amos Marsh arrived on a Friday, hand-delivered by his youngest ranch hand, who had instructions to wait for a reply. It said only, "Come alone, today if you can." Calhoun went. He did not tell her where. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window and then stood at the window a little longer looking at the road. She was a practical woman. She had told him so. Practically speaking, she should be using this time to check the timeline she had constructed, to review what she knew, versus what she could prove, to calculate how many of the 79 days remained, and what each of them needed to produce. 52 days had passed since her arrival. 38 remaining, practically speaking. Instead, she went to the barn. She fed the horses because they needed it, and because being near them had a particular quality of not needing to be anything other than present that she found she could use. Calhoun had been right that Patience was a good horse, even-tempered. Curious, with a way of turning her head when spoken to that suggested she found conversation mildly interesting. Evangeline had ridden her 4 times now, and could feel where the mare's responses lived the small hesitations and willingness that told you what you needed to know about an animal's character. She thought about Calhoun in Kansas. She thought about Amos Marsh with his leather-worn face arriving without announcement. She thought about the name Grath and the water rights dispute in the holding company in Santa Fe. She thought about the stories from Kansas that were not good stories. She thought about what Boone had said, "You don't have the cards." She had one card that Boone did not know about. The receipt in the false bottom of the wooden box was the only piece of evidence she had found that connected Boone directly to Silas on a specific date, 3 days before Silas died. It proved Silas had received money from Boone. It did not prove what the money was for. It did not prove that Boone had arranged what happened at the mine. What she needed was a second piece, something that showed a pattern rather than a single transaction, something that a court or a prosecutor or a territorial judge could not set aside. She did not know yet how to get it. She was standing in the middle of the barn, with Patience's nose against her shoulder, when she heard Calhoun ride back in. He dismounted faster than usual, she could tell by the sound of it, and came into the barn with the purposeful stride of a man who has just been told something that has changed the shape of his afternoon. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise. "Marsh told me something," he said. "I know," she said. "You rode back fast." He put the bay in its stall and stood at the stall door with his hand on the wood. She waited. "Dermot Finch," he said. "Nora's husband. Marsh was his foreman for 6 months before the accident. He says Dermot found something in the mine records, not the official records, the actual physical survey of the lower shaft. The silver deposit was mapped as played out in the official filing. In the actual survey, it wasn't played out. It was larger than anything documented in the district." She was very still. Boone filed false records. The operation was running at a fraction of its real yield. The rest went somewhere else. He looked at her. "Marsh says Dermot planned to report it. He says the accident happened 3 days after Dermot told his supervisor he had found the discrepancy." 3 days. She thought about the date on the receipt. March 14th. Silas had died on March 17th. She thought about what it meant that both men had been given 3 days. "Nora knows this," she said. "Some of it. Marsh isn't sure how much." He paused. "He said she has something. He doesn't know what." She looked at the hay on the barn floor, the specific way dust moved in the shaft of light from the high window. She was fitting pieces together in her mind with the precision of a woman who had been fitting pieces together for 14 months. and they were beginning to align in a way that produced a shape she recognized. She looked up at Calhoun. "We need to talk to Nora Finch," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Evie," he said and stopped. "What?" He looked at her with an expression that had something in it she had not seen before. Not the careful neutrality she had learned to read. Not the particular quality of his occupied silences. Something older than calculation. Something that was simply one person looking at another person and not having a prepared thing to say. "Marsh asked me why I picked your name specifically," he said. "Out of the advertisement." She waited. "I told him what I told you, that your letter was practical, and he told me I was lying. He said it without embarrassment. He's known me long enough to tell." The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted its weight in its stall. "Why did you pick my name?" she said. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even, but with the evenness of something that has been made. Even not that arrived that way. "I found a copy of a Philadelphia police report in a document Boone's deputy left behind in the land office last spring. I was there on other business, and the deputy was careless, and I saw your name on it. Silas Voss, deceased widow Evangeline Voss, Philadelphia." The report noted the widow had asked questions about the mine that the investigating officer had marked as... He paused, persistent. She did not speak. "I thought," he said, "that a woman who kept asking questions after she was told there were no answers might be someone I could trust. To keep asking questions here." He looked at the barn door. "And I thought that if Boone saw her name coming into the district, he might..." He stopped. "He might stop watching the ranch," she said, "and start watching me. I know that's..." It drew his attention directly to me, she said, not angrily, with the calm of someone doing arithmetic. "It put me in the middle of this without telling me I was in the middle of it." "Yes," he said. He did not apologize, and he did not make excuses which she registered. She looked at the horse. She looked at the high window. She looked at the particular quality of the late afternoon light in the territory, which was nothing like the light in Philadelphia. Wider, somehow more generous, as though it were spreading itself across too much space and doing it willingly. "I need you to tell me," she said, "everything you know. Not what you think is relevant. Everything." He looked at her for a long moment. "That will take a while," he said. "Then we'd better start." They sat at the kitchen table until the light was gone, and Evangeline had lit the lamp and he'd told her what he knew. It was not everything she needed. There were pieces he didn't have, gaps he couldn't fill. But it was the map of what he had been building for 2 years, which was a picture of Boone's operation that had the shape of a pattern without the legal spine to hold it up. The properties, the names, the dates, the methods always legal on the surface, always procedural, always using the machinery of the law as a lever to move things that the law itself could not move directly. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions precisely, at points where the map had soft edges. He answered them with the same precision. When he was finished, she sat for a moment with her hands folded on the table. "You have the shape of it," she said. "What you're missing is the mechanism, the actual transactions, the money that moved." "Yes. If we could find that, it would have to go to Santa Fe," he said. "The territorial prosecutor. Boone has everything here in his pocket." She thought about the receipt in the false bottom of the wooden box. She had not told him about it. She had been carrying it alone for 14 months, and the habit of carrying it alone had become structural. It was part of how the plan worked, which was that the plan belonged to her, that she was the only one who knew all of it, that she could not be surprised by someone else's knowledge of it. But she was beginning to understand that this plan, her plan, the plan of a woman with a seamstress's income and one piece of paper, and no legal stand-in in a territory where she had been a resident for 52 days, was not going to be enough by itself. She thought about what Boone had said. You don't have the cards. She thought about what it would mean to lay down what she had and ask someone else to hold part of the hand. I have something, she said. A receipt. From Boone to Silas, dated 3 days before Silas died. It proves contact. It doesn't prove what happened. She watched his face. He was very still. You've had it since Philadelphia, he said. It was not a question. Yes. That's why you came. Yes. He looked at the lamp flame for a moment. Then he said, Why are you telling me now? She considered the answer. She thought about the quality of his silences. She thought about the way he had said persistent with something in his voice that was not quite admiration, and not quite its absence. She thought about 14 months of carrying this alone, and about the barn a few hours ago, and about the particular feeling of pieces beginning to align. Because Boone has already come to this house, she said, and because you already know more than I can keep managing around, and because she stopped. Because, he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. Because I think Nora Finch has something we don't. And I think if we're going to ask her for it, she needs to see 2 people asking. Not one person with an agenda and one person who doesn't know what the agenda is. He held her gaze for a long moment. The lamp between them threw its small, steady light, and outside the New Mexico darkness was absolute and cold and without any of the ambient glow of a city which made the interior of the kitchen feel very small and very bright by contrast. You're right, he said. She nodded once. She put her hands flat on the table, both of them in the gesture she had made that afternoon after Boone left, not pressing down this time, but simply present. 26 days, she said, because there were 26 days left of the 38 remaining when she had last counted, and she had been counting during the conversation, because she always kept track. 26 days, he agreed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere far to the north, a fire had been lit against the cold. She could smell the wood smoke faintly through the kitchen window she had left cracked an inch. The territory making its sounds. The territory going on the way it went on without regard for any of the specific human difficulties occurring within it. She got up and closed the window and then stood with her back to the room for a moment, looking at the dark glass and her own faint reflection in it. A woman in a dark blue dress that had been good quality once, with her hair coming loose at the back of her neck. From a long day standing in a kitchen in New Mexico that was not hers, and was not quite not hers, either, at the edge of something she had been walking toward for 14 months, and was only now beginning to see the actual shape of. She turned back to the room. Tomorrow, she said, I'll go see Nora Finch. Nora Finch opened the door before Evangeline knocked. She had been watching from the window. Evangeline understood that immediately, the way you understand things about a person who shares your particular habits of vigilance. Nora stepped back and let her in without greeting, which was its own kind of welcome, the kind that dispensed with the performance of welcome and simply made space. The laundry was closed for the morning. The front room held 2 large wooden washtubs, a mangle press, and the smell of lye soap that had soaked into the walls over years until it was part of the building's own smell. The living quarters were through a door at the back, small clean with a window that looked out onto the alley, and a table with 2 chairs positioned to face each other, which suggested that Nora did not often have company and had arranged her space accordingly. She put water on for coffee without asking. She sat across from Evangeline with her hands wrapped around her own cup, and her amber eyes were direct and patient. The eyes of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had decided not to hurry it. "You talked to Marsh," she said. "Calhoun did," Evangeline said. "He told him about Dermot, about what Dermot found in the survey records." Nora was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite grief, and not quite its absence. The expression of someone who has processed a loss so many times that it no longer produces the sharp sensation, but still produces the weight of it. "Dermot was not a complicated man," she said. "That was what I loved about him. He found a thing that was wrong, and he thought he should say so. And he didn't survive that way of thinking in a place like this." She looked at the window. "I was angry at him for it for about a year. Then I stopped being angry because it didn't change anything, and I started thinking about what to do instead." "What did you do?" Evangeline said. Nora stood and went to the back wall. There was a shelf there with tins of soap and blacking and starch, the mundane inventory of her trade, and she moved 3 tins aside to reveal a small box of punch tin behind them. She brought it to the table and set it down. "Dermot kept a copy of the lower shaft survey," she said. "Not the official one. The actual one, the numbers as he found them. He was a careful man that way. He kept a copy of everything he thought might matter." She opened the box. Inside was a piece of oilskin folded many times. She unfolded it carefully on the table, and Evangeline looked at what was inside. It was a handwritten survey document, 12 pages, the handwriting dense and technical. Numbers, measurements, calculations. At the top of the first page, lower shaft B. Cimarron, Silver Mine. Actual survey, D. Finch. September 1882. And at the bottom, in different ink and different handwriting, an annotation added later that read, "Official filing discrepancy 340%. See attached." There was no attached document, but there didn't need to be. 340%, Evangeline said. "The official record showed the mine at near capacity extraction," Nora said. "The actual yield was 3.5 times what was declared. The difference went somewhere that was not the territorial government's tax records." She refolded the oilskin with the care of someone who had unfolded and refolded it many times, always carefully, always putting it back in the same way. "I've kept this for 2 years. I knew what it was. I didn't know what to do with it." "Why not?" Nora looked at her steadily. "Because I'm a woman alone in a small town, and the man whose name is on that operation wears a badge and has a deputy who is 23 years old and does exactly what he's told. And the nearest territorial prosecutor is in Santa Fe, which is a day and a half away, and anything I filed here would land on Boone's desk within an hour of my filing it. She paused. I also didn't have a corroborating witness. A document alone is a claim, Evangeline said. 2 documents are a pattern. Nora looked at her. You have something? A receipt. Boone paid my husband 3 days before my husband died in your husband's mine. Money for, she paused, services rendered in the matter of account verification. The laundry was very quiet. The water in the pot on the stove had begun to tremble toward boiling. He was your bookkeeper, Nora said. He verified accounts. I believe Boone paid him to confirm the discrepancy could not be traced to put a professional signature on the fiction, that the numbers were clean. She looked at the tin box. And then Boone decided a professional who knew the numbers were not clean was a liability. Nora pressed her lips together. Her eyes were very still. He paid Dermot too, she said, early on, before Dermot knew what he was looking at. A consulting fee, Dermot called it. He was pleased. Her voice did not waver, but it did something more difficult. It remained entirely level, which required more effort than wavering would have. By the time Dermot understood what he'd been paid to not find, it was already too late to give the money back. Evangeline thought of Silas at his desk, the careful handwriting, the locked drawer, the way he had kept things separate from her, and how she had understood that separation as protection, and had been wrong. It had not been protection but calculation, and the calculation had failed. She did not say this to Nora, but she thought that Nora probably knew something like it already from the particular angle of the woman's expression, which was the expression of someone who had made their own accounting of a marriage and found it more complicated than they had expected. We need a third signature, Evangeline said, on the affidavit. Yours, mine, and someone who can speak to the land operation, the properties Boone has taken, the mechanism. Red, Nora said. He has records going back 2 years. Property transfers, legal filings, correspondence with his attorney in Santa Fe. He can speak to the pattern of acquisition. She looked at Nora. Can you trust him? Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, he was the one who told me the winter after Dermot died that I didn't have to leave, that the town would be that people would not. She stopped. He said it plainly without making a production of it. That's the kind of thing you remember about a person. Evangeline nodded. Then we need a notary, she said. And we need to get to Santa Fe before Boone knows we're going. They met that evening at the ranch, the 3 of them with Amos Marsh at the corner of the room, because it was not possible to have a conversation in his vicinity that he was not part of, and because he was a witness to enough of the history that his presence was useful rather than otherwise. Calhoun laid out what he had on the table. 2 years of documented observations, a file of correspondence with his Santa Fe attorney, copies of the land transfer records he had obtained from the county recorder's office in the period before Boone had appointed a compliant deputy to manage that office. He had been building this for 2 years alone, the same way Evangeline had been building hers for 14 months, and the same way Nora had been building hers since the autumn of 1882. Each of them in isolation. Each of them with a piece of the shape, but not the whole of it. It was, she thought, a particular kind of waste. 3 people pointing at the same thing from different distances and none of them able to see the complete outline. She did not say this out loud. It was not productive to say it out loud. What she said instead was, we have enough. Marsh looked at the documents arranged on the table. He was a man who did not speak without reason, and he spent a moment longer looking before he spoke. "For Santa Fe," he said. "For Santa Fe," she said. "Dermot's survey with its annotation establishes the financial fraud. The receipt establishes that Boone paid to suppress the evidence and that the suppression was followed within days by the death of the man he paid. Calhoun's records establish the pattern of legal coercion, that this was not two isolated incidents but a method repeated across multiple properties over multiple years." She looked around the table. "No single piece is sufficient. Together they are." "Boone has connections in Santa Fe," Calhoun said, not objecting, mapping the terrain. "His connections are social and political," she said. "A sworn affidavit from 3 residents with supporting documentary evidence goes to the territorial prosecutor, not to Boone's social connections. What he has in Santa Fe won't help him with a properly filed criminal complaint." "You know territorial law," Marsh said. He said it with the particular curiosity of a man who has reassessed something. "I know how to read," she said. "I spent 3 months reading everything I could find about New Mexico territorial law before I got on the train. The Kensington Library had more than you'd expect." Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Calhoun looked at Evangeline across the table. She met his eyes. Something passed between them that was not words and did not need to be an acknowledgement, perhaps, of what it cost to have done all of this separately for all of this time, and what it meant to do it together now. "The notary," he said. "It can't be anyone in Cimarron. The nearest independent notary is in Rayado," Marsh said. 18 miles. I know the man. He considered his word choice. "Not a friend of Boone's. We'd need to go early," Nora said, "before the land office opens." "Before anyone in town is moving," Calhoun said. "Boone has eyes in Cimarron. If he sees us together and heading east, he'll know something is happening," Evangeline said, "but not what. And by the time he knows what, the documents will already be in Santa Fe." She said it with a certainty she had earned, not assumed, the certainty of a woman who had spent 14 months doing arithmetic in the dark and had arrived at a number she trusted. Boone moved before they did. She should have anticipated it. She did anticipate it. In the abstract, she had accounted for the possibility of him accelerating when he felt pressure. What she had not fully accounted for was the precision of his timing, which was the precision of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how much rope to give before he pulled it. 2 mornings before they planned to go to Rayado, she woke to the sound of horses at the gate. It was early, not yet. First light, the sky still that particular shade of deep blue that existed only in the 20 minutes before dawn began to separate from night. She was at the window before she was fully awake, the habit of attention operating ahead of the rest of her. 2 riders. She could not see their faces in the darkness, but one of them sat a horse with the careful, upright posture of a young man who had been told how to present himself on horseback and had not yet stopped thinking about it. They were not at the gate. They were at the fence line 50 yards east, and they were not moving. Just present. Just visible enough to be seen from the house. She dressed in the dark. She went to the kitchen and lit the lamp low, and she stood with her back to the wall beside the window, where she could see the fence line without being visible from outside. Calhoun appeared in the doorway of the parlor 3 minutes later. He was already dressed, which told her He had heard the horses before she did. He came to the window and looked. "Two of them," she said. "I see. They want us to see them," she said. "This isn't surveillance. This is a message." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He knows we've been talking to Nora." It was not a question, but she considered it as one. "He knows we've been meeting. He may not know what was said." She paused. "Or he may know exactly what was said. If he knew exactly what was said, we wouldn't be looking at two men at the fence. We'd be looking at a legal notice. He's not ready to move," she said. "He wants us to move first. Or he wants us to run." Calhoun turned from the window. He stood in the low lamplight with his arms at his sides, and the look of a man who was doing the same arithmetic she was doing, arriving at the same place. "We moved the timeline," he said. "Yes. Rayado tonight. Leave after dark. Marsh needs to know," she said. "And Nora. I'll ride to Marsh this morning, not on the main road." She looked at the fence line. The two riders were still still as something painted on the landscape. "I'll go to Nora," she said. He looked at her. "They'll follow you into town." "I know," she said. "Let them. I have mending to deliver to 3 households this morning. I've been delivering mending to 3 households every week for 6 weeks. If I ride to town, get off my horse, knock on doors, and exchange pleasantries about thread counts, they can follow me all morning and see exactly what a seamstress does on a Thursday." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she had said something he had not considered and was considering now. "And Nora," he said. "Nora does my laundry," she said. "There is nothing unusual about dropping a bundle at her back door." She rode into Cimarron in the clear morning light with a basket of finished mending on the saddle, and one of Boone's riders at a distance of about 200 yards behind her, which was far enough to be deniable and close enough to be a statement. She delivered the mending. She stopped at the general store and spent 12 minutes discussing the relative merits of 2 grades of wool thread with the proprietor's wife. She did it attentively because it was not possible to do something inattentively, simply because it was a cover for something else. That was how people were caught, by the slight vacancy behind the eyes when they were thinking about where they actually needed to be. She went to Nora's back door with a bundle of laundry she had brought for precisely this purpose. Nora opened it before she could knock. Inside, with the back door closed, she spoke quickly and quietly. "Tonight. After dark. Rayado. Bring the box." Nora looked at her. "He moved the timeline. He put men at our fence before dawn." Nora was still for a moment. Then she went to the shelf and moved the soap tins and took down the punch tin box and held it in both hands, looking at it. "23 years ago," she said, "I came to New Mexico from Ohio with a man I had known for 8 months because he said there was something here worth building." She was not talking to Evangeline specifically. She was talking in the way that people talk when they are putting something down that they have been carrying and want a witness to the putting down. And there was something worth building. He built it. He found the thing that was wrong and he tried to do the right thing about it. And he died for it. She looked up. "I've been trying to decide what to do with that ever since. Whether the right thing he tried to do is worth—" She stopped. "It is," Evangeline said. Nora looked at her. "I don't know what my husband was worth," Evangeline said quietly. "I don't know if what he did at the end was brave or foolish or something smaller than either of those things. I know he kept a record. I know he didn't destroy it." She paused. "Whatever else is true about him, he kept a record. And that record is what we have, and we are going to use it, going to." Nora held the tin box for another moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket, and the weight of it settled against her side, and her expression settled with it into something that was not peace exactly, but was its practical equivalent the look of a person who has made a decision and is no longer in the space of making it. "Tonight," she said. "After dark," Evangeline said. "Meet us at Marsh's gate." They rode to Rayado in the dark, with Amos Marsh leading because he knew the road, and they did not. And the stars overhead were the particular density that exists only in high desert, away from any settlement. So many of them that the sky looked crowded, which struck Evangeline as unlikely given the scale of what she was looking up at. She rode between Calhoun and Nora. No one spoke much. There was not much to say that was not already understood. The notary in Rayado was a man named Alderman, who had been a territorial judge before his retirement, and who received them in his kitchen at 2 a.m. with the matter-of-fact calm of someone who had seen enough of the territory's particular justice to not be surprised by people arriving in the dark with documents that needed witnessing. He read everything. He read it slowly with the thoroughness of his former profession, asking 3 clarifying questions and making 2 annotations with Nora's permission in the margins of Dermot's survey to clarify technical language. He looked at the receipt from Boone to Silas and looked at Evangeline for a moment with the expression of someone who was understanding a number of things simultaneously. Then he prepared the affidavit. It was a long document. She had expected it to feel momentous, the signing of it, but it felt instead like the completion of a very long calculation, the last line written the final sum arrived at. She wrote her name in the same clear hand she always used. Nora signed beside her, and then Calhoun and Alderman added his seal and his own signature beneath all 3. He made 3 copies, which took another half-hour. By the time it was done, the eastern horizon had begun to lighten slightly, a dark blue going toward gray. The mountains becoming visible as shapes rather than darkness. Alderman kept 1 copy. Calhoun took 1 copy for the Santa Fe attorney. The 3rd went into the tin box with Dermot Finch's survey, and the box went back into Nora's coat pocket. "Santa Fe," Alderman said as they were leaving. "Don't stop in Cimarron first." They didn't. Calhoun and Amos Marsh rode to Santa Fe with the documents. Evangeline stayed in Rayado with Nora because someone needed to, and because she was not willing to return to the ranch alone until the filing was done and on the record. They stayed 2 nights with Alderman's daughter, a woman of 40, who asked no questions and provided excellent coffee and a room with 2 beds, where Evangeline slept more deeply than she had slept since Philadelphia, which she thought was perhaps because she was not sleeping on top of anything she needed to protect. On the 2nd morning, she sat with Nora in the small kitchen, and they drank coffee and did not talk about Boone or the documents or Santa Fe. Nora talked about Dermot not the way she had talked about him before, with the careful evenness of someone managing the weight of what they were saying, but with a particular lightness that Evangeline recognized as what it sounded like when you had been carrying something so long that the habit of carrying it had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. And then you set it down, and you realized the carrying was over. She talked about how he had danced badly, but enthusiastically at their wedding. She talked about how he kept every letter he had ever received in a tin box, which was why she had chosen a tin box. For the survey copy, she had wanted it to be in something of his, even if he would never know. She talked about the garden he had started behind their first house in Ohio, and never finished because they had left for New Mexico before the summer was out. Evangeline listened. She thought about what it meant to know a person well enough to keep talking about them after they were gone. She thought about Silas and found that what she had was not enough to sustain a conversation. What she had was a shape of him, the outline, the careful handwriting, and the locked desk, and the part of him that had in the end kept a record. It was something. It was not everything, but it was something, and she supposed that was what you were left with. Not the complete person, but the things that person had left behind them in the world, intentionally or otherwise. And what you did with those things was its own kind of answer to the question of what they had been worth. Calhoun and Marsh returned on the afternoon of the third day. She heard the horses before she saw them, and she noticed that her first response was not calculation, but relief. The uncomplicated relief of recognizing a specific quality of hoofbeat and knowing who it belonged to. She noticed this the way she noticed many things and registered that what she felt was different from what she had expected it to be. Calhoun came through the door with the look of a man who has done what he set out to do and is not yet certain how he feels about having done it. Marsh came behind him with the look of a man who is thinking about getting home before dark. "It's filed," Calhoun said. "The prosecutor's office received it this morning. They are," he paused, interested. That was the word they used. They would be sending a territorial marshal to Cimarron within the week. Nora made a sound that was quiet and small and complete. Marsh shook hands with everyone in the room, said something about fence mending that needed doing before winter, and left with the particular efficiency of a man who has been part of something significant and is ready to return to the work of ordinary life. Then it was the three of them, Calhoun, Nora, Evangeline, in the small kitchen in Rayado in the afternoon light. "What happens to him?" Nora said. "Trial," Calhoun said. "The prosecutor said the documentary evidence was strong, with 3 witnesses and Alderman's certification. There is, he chose his words, very little room to maneuver. He'll have lawyers," Nora said. "He'll have lawyers," Calhoun agreed. "It will take time. It will not be clean or quick, but the filing is public record now. What he's done is public record." Nora nodded slowly. She looked out the window at the mountains. "That's enough," she said in a tone that meant she had decided it was enough, which was not the same as it being everything she wanted, but was what there was, and she was choosing to receive it. They rode back to Cimarron the following morning. The territorial marshal arrived 4 days later, as the prosecutor's office had said. Boone was taken into custody on a Thursday afternoon outside the land office, which struck Evangeline as fitting not dramatically, not in the way of stories where the setting mirrors the meaning, but practically fitting in the way that practical things often were. He had built his operation on the mechanisms of the land office. It was not the worst place to have it end. She did not go to watch. She had enough of what she needed without watching. That night, after Calhoun had gone out to tend the horses, she sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened the wooden box not to take anything out, not to review anything that needed reviewing, just to look at what was there. The receipt. The spools of thread, their colors muted in the lamplight. The leather thimble case. The paper patterns folded flat. She looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she closed the box and left it on the table and went to bed and slept without dreaming. On the morning after, she went to the notary in Cimarron. It was a small office on the side street behind the general store, with a window that needed cleaning and a desk that held more paper than it had been designed for. The notary was a man in his 50s named Cresswell, who she had met twice before in the course of ordinary business, and who had the reassuring quality of someone who found documents interesting for their own sake. She sat across from him and presented what she had: the affidavit, the proof of the filing, the marriage certificate. "What are you filing?" he said. She put the final document on the desk. She had written it herself 3 days ago in Rayado, in the careful hand she used for things that needed to be legible. It was a declaration of permanent co-ownership, not the provisional arrangement of the original registration, but a full legal claim jointly held in both their names. It was not a statement of the terms of their marriage. It was not a promise about the future. It was a piece of paper that said 2 specific people had built something together, and that the law of New Mexico Territory recognized it as belonging to both of them. Cresswell read it. He looked at her. "Is your husband aware of—" "He's waiting outside," she said. Cresswell looked at the window. Through the dirty glass, the shape of Calhoun Red was visible standing beside Patience, with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the mountains. Cresswell called him in. Calhoun came through the door and sat in the chair beside Evangeline, not across from her. Beside her, the way he had sat at the corner of the kitchen table the evening she had first told him about Boone's visit. And Cresswell put the document between them and explained what it said. She watched Calhoun read it. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, with the full attention of someone who trusted the written word enough to take it seriously. When he finished, he sat for a moment. He looked at her. She looked at him. She thought of something she had heard him say to one of the horses early on, when he didn't know she could hear him from the barn. A quiet, practical word of acknowledgement. The kind of thing you say to a creature that has done what you asked and done it well, and deserves to know that you noticed. "You planned all of it," he said. Not an accusation. An observation delivered with the same evenness he gave to observations about weather, or fence line, or the condition of the creek. "Not all of it," she said honestly. "You were not in my plan. And now—" She considered. She thought about what plans were worth and what they weren't, and about the difference between knowing where you intended to go and understanding where you actually were. "Now I'm adjusting the plan," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the pen. "Cresswell," he said, "where do I sign?" They walked out of the notary's office into the October light of Cimarron, which was cold and clear, and coming from an angle that made everything look more substantial than it did in summer. The shadows longer and more precise. She carried the wooden box under her left arm. She had carried it that way since Philadelphia. Close attentive, the weight of it integrated into her movement. But as they came down the step onto the street, she shifted it. She set it on the bench outside the notary's office, straightened and looked at the mountains. The box sat on the bench without her holding it, She stood for a moment with her hands free. Calhoun stopped beside her. He looked at the box and then at her, and she thought he was going to ask about it, but he didn't. He simply waited the occupied silence she had spent 2 months learning to read, and had arrived at reading as I am here. I am not going anywhere. You don't have to explain. She picked the box back up. Not the same way, not tucked under her arm against her ribs, but held at her side loose the way you carry something when you are carrying it to somewhere, rather than carrying it because you have nowhere to put it down. She looked at him. He looked at her. I know you didn't come here for me, he said. The words were quiet without self-pity. The statement of a fact being placed on the table for consideration. I know what you came here for, and I know you got it. A pause. But I'm glad you came. She stood in the October light with the mountains at the edge of the sky and the grassland going gold around the town, and the 38 remaining days reduced now to 0. The account balanced the sum arrived at. I know, she said. She did not walk away. She stood in the light beside him. And after a moment, he began to walk. And she walked beside him, and Patience was at the hitching post, and they untied her in the bay and rode back toward the ranch in the late morning side by side. Not talking much, the territory opening around them, the way it always did, without ceremony, without sentiment, simply extending itself in every direction and letting you find your own place in it. The mountains held the sky. The grass moved in the wind. The road was long and familiar now in a way that roads became after you had ridden them enough times to stop thinking about where they were going. In the false bottom of the wooden box, the receipt from Boone and Cimarron Land Company was still there. She had not destroyed it. It would go to the prosecutor's office in Santa Fe as supporting evidence, and then it would become part of a legal record, and then someday, probably, it would be filed away in some archive, in a building in a city which was its own kind of being remembered. Silas Voss had kept a record. She had found it. She had carried it here across 14 months and 1,500 miles to the place where it could do what records were supposed to do. That was the account. That was the sum. The rest was not something she could calculate in advance. The rest was the kind of thing you discovered by staying in the place where it was happening and paying close attention over time. Which was, she had come to understand, the only honest method. She had stayed in worse places. She had stayed for worse reasons. The ranch appeared on the rise ahead of them. The timber house, the good barn, the straight fences, the horses in the corral catching the morning light. The territory stretching away from it in every direction. All that space holding everything it held, requiring nothing of anyone, except that they look at it honestly and decide what they were willing to build. She looked at it honestly. She decided. It was, all things considered, a practical decision. The most practical she had ever made.